Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Los Cenizos wash processed Panama from Meow Coffee Roastery. And there's the bag right there. And Meow, based out of Tsing, Hong Kong, and this is their first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And like with a lot of our recent Asian coffee roaster reviews, we picked this coffee up from Airworks as part of one of their special releases. And I did have a discussion with Airworks about this coffee, and they mentioned that somebody had suggested this coffee roaster and this coffee to them, highlighting the fact that there aren't a lot of North American-based coffee roasters that offer Los Cenizos coffees. In fact, the only coffee roaster in North America I've seen carrying one was, say, after they released one after we'd already picked this coffee up. So it did feel like a great opportunity to try out a brand new Panamanian geisha, as well as a brand new coffee roaster. So we'll see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 48. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So going into it, I did expect this coffee to turn out a little bit lighter than it did end up being, as we've had some recent experiences with some Asian-based coffee roasters that have been on the very, very light side of things. That's not to say that this coffee is necessarily overly developed. If anything, it does remind me of some of Say's more recent offerings, which do have a slight bit more development to them than they used to. With all of that, it's still, I would say, on the more moderately light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 24, first impression, and we opted for the V60. And the coffee was definitely off to a nice start, as it was offering plenty of the expected geisha-like qualities in the citric and floral scents, with a very nice level of stone fruit sweetness as well, and plenty of clarity. In addition to that, there's a bit of graininess and a nice bit of brightness to it as well, with the coffee improving quite a bit on the cool down in a mostly floral finish. So I definitely did appreciate the first impression we had of this one. Day 27 through the Chemex, and the coffee does continue to offer plenty of the expected geisha-like characteristics, with plenty of the cleanliness, and this time a bit more of a bergamot-like characteristic at the forefront. Plenty of depth as it does cool down to some more of the peachy and jasmine-like aspects of it, so another solid day this time around. Day 30 through the April brewer, and the coffee is possibly the best it has been to this point, as there's nice intensity to the fruit profiles with a better defined jasmine component as well. Mostly peach forward, but again, there's plenty of complementary citrus and brightness to go with it. So overall, pretty solid. A couple of really nice days on this one. Day 33 through the V60 with Meow's brew guide, and if I recall correctly, I think that they do have some lower temperatures for their coffee, and it's been a bit more citric forward off brew, but the coffee itself did kind of lend itself towards a slightly sweeter stone fruit finish in that sense. It's still clean with more of the well-defined jasmine florality, so I would say that for the most part, with this one skewing a little bit more on the citric side of things, I didn't enjoy it quite as much as some of the earlier days. We move on to day 36 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was a bit more tame this time around, as it was focusing a lot more on the citric lemon attributes. In addition to that, there wasn't as much depth, as it remained pretty consistent right off brew with a super heightened focus on the lemon aspects. So the coffee up to this point had a lot of depth, and at this time it was skewing so much more in the citric side of things without that great stone fruit and floral sweetness to it. Day 39 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and interestingly, it just felt like the coffee had backtracked in general, as we've struggled to replicate some of the very positive first experiences we had had with this one. Truth be told, after the first time brewing it, I said, okay, the coffee isn't quite as defined in that stone fruit sense. I'm still getting some nice things and maybe some more depth from it, but it's been hard to replicate that very prominent experience we'd had right from the start. This time I would say that it's offering an almost pine-like taste with a slightly unripened fruit aspect to it. Citric components have become the most prominent component within this one once again. And on day 42, we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and once again, it does have a nice start, but it seems to struggle from that point going forward, as it's been mostly lemon focused with a very strong lemon candy feel. Secondary component feels like the listed jasmine with a slightly spiced tea quality to it this time around. A slight bit of the pine is still present with a subtle stone fruit and melon quality that's also in the background of what is a pretty citric forward coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And even though I think that's probably the most important thing to discuss when it comes to a wash-processed Panamanian geisha, it is worth highlighting that the definition within this coffee wasn't necessarily always the best, especially given that it did tend to skew a lot more on the citric side of things as opposed to maybe some additional floral and stone fruit-like qualities that were present on some of the earlier days. Even then, I would say at its very best, when we were experiencing some really nice definition to the qualities in this coffee, it wasn't to the extent that it ever would have justified that level 5. I think this coffee is pretty clean, but maybe not to the standards and expectations for a wash-processed Panamanian geisha. Finish, level 4. And on some of the earlier days, I really appreciated the finish as it did come in a number of different ways, most notably a lot of the floral aspects that seemed to linger on the palate a bit. But towards the end, it just continued to skew a lot more on the citric side of things to the point where it was the most overly dominant aspect within this coffee. Sweetness, level 4, I'd have to say, still one of the better qualities of this coffee, as this one still offered plenty of sweetness, especially for a wash-processed coffee, and it certainly came in a lot more of the fruit sense, especially in regards to the stone fruit at times, and in addition to that, the aforementioned citric qualities, which did seem to have a little bit more sweetness to them, as opposed to maybe something like some bitterness. We move on to the acidity, level 4, and I think that's one of the takeaways I had from the very first day and something that was an ever-present quality throughout within this one, as there's just a lot of brightness to it, and I'm not entirely sure if I was expecting there to be as much of the citric qualities in terms of that brightness as there was throughout the entirety of this coffee, but it did seem to last quite a bit, so level 4 is where we opted to put that. We move on to the florality, level 4, and I did mention the jasmine qualities, and towards the end they weren't quite as defined and pronounced as some of the earlier days. It was, I would say, much more of a generic citric floral aspect towards the end of this coffee, though on the earlier days you were definitely experiencing a fair bit of that jasmine-like tone. Move on to the citrus fruit, level 4, and that's the thing I highlighted the most from a couple of the first impressions going forward, as this coffee really seemed to skew pretty heavily in that direction, and not to the extent where it was overly dominant for the entirety of the coffee, but to the point where it just seemed to be the most prominent aspect within this one. A couple of level 3s. We'll start with the berry fruit, level 3, and I did mention that there is that slightly melon-like quality that is present within this one, and I think that goes with the stone fruit, which is also there at the level 3. There is a nice fresh fruit aspect to this one, and I'm also highlighting that peachiness that was present on some of the earlier days, and I was fully expecting that to reach level 4 by the end, but it was so interesting that I really struggled to replicate that coffee or that experience even with making the same sort of adjustments towards the later days. Savoriness, level 3, that is the spiced quality, the tea-like spiced quality that I'd mentioned within this one, as it really seemed to be one of the more defining aspects towards the later days. It's not something that I even mentioned too often early on in this coffee, but it became much more abundant from that point going forward. And then final thing worth discussing, and maybe the most interesting thing actually in this tasting wheel, is that the body's at a level 3, and I can't remember the last time we had a Panamanian geisha that actually scored a level 3 for the body, but I did take note of the fact that this one had notably more texture and body to it relative to the vast majority of Panamanian geishas that we have reviewed in the past, so that is something that was certainly worth highlighting and discussing. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like it's kind of mixed, but for the most part, given that it started off so positive, I had some much higher expectations for the way that this coffee ended up. Given that this coffee just seems to skew a lot more in a direction that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of. I've said in the past that I'm not the biggest fan of citric coffees in general, especially when it comes to Panamanian geishas. So there are a couple of things with that being probably the biggest sticking point for me. But the other one being that I always want my Panamanian geishas to score that level 5 in terms of the cleanliness to them. But outside of that, there were some nice things that I did pick up from this coffee, and we are going to be discussing one other coffee from Red Meow that we also picked up as part of that special release, so that's something that I might discuss a little bit more about this coffee in that review as well. But for the most part, I think my expectations were just a little higher than this coffee ended up being. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you do like your slightly more textured, heavier bodied, and more citric forward geishas, then this one's a very interesting fit because it did offer that unique aspect to it, and that was probably the most notable thing that I did take away from this coffee, was that it just seemed to have a little bit more body than you were going to expect from something like this. And while I could say that that was a little bit of a sticking point for me on this coffee, given I want my Panamanian geishas to act like Panamanian geishas, I felt like it gave it just a little bit of a unique characteristic relative to a lot of the other ones we've reviewed on this channel. I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, This right here has been a review of the Los Cenizos wash processed Panama from Red Meow Coffee Roastery. Thank you for watching.